Now, a game design project is split up into about Now, a game design project is split up into three separate parts. There's pre-production, production, and post-production. Within pre-production, what we have within pre-production, the way any game starts is with an idea. Someone needs to have a game done. This might be a game that's a companion product to a marketing. Now, this might be a game that's a companion to a movie, so you know that you're going to make a game and you just need to go figure out who's going to make it and what game it is. But sometimes these games are coming from the creation. But sometimes these games just come from the creative minds of a game designer. Or a game design team if you're in Valve or another company that works in the Cabal or if you work at Valve or another company that has the Cabal strategy where you work together as a team to come up with a cohesive design. In pre-production, what you're going to have is a very small team creating a set of documents that start with a concept document or a pitch document. Now, this pitch document might be anywhere between 1 and 5 pages long. And there's actually a handout online, and there's a handout that I'm going to send, and there's a handout for you, and there's a handout showing you an example of this online. 1. And in the pre-production section, we have the lead designer, lead programmer, and lead artist, typically, and what they're doing is they're working together to create a game strategy. And they're working together to create a game concept. And they're doing a lot of documentation and a lot of first steps. They're designing the art style. They're trying to figure out if they're going to be cartoony or realistic. They're creating prototype gameplay elements that are going to jump into gameplay that they want to have, and they're trying to make that really interesting and really good. For instance, I actually think that the Mass Effect practice room, I think it's in Mass Effect 3, is one of the coolest little rooms. If I was a game designer and I had infinite money and I could just create something without any oversight, I would probably create a room. And if I was creating a game like Mass Effect, I'd actually create one of those practice rooms, and I wouldn't even try to do much else outside of that room. In fact, that's actually how we usually worked on games like Spider-Man. We would have a couple different maps, and we would have a couple different practice maps. Each practice map executed a different set of commands that Spider-Man or whoever it was that we were working on at the time, we would have them be able to platform around, and we would test out every single scenario that we could do. And then after that, we would take all this knowledge from pre-production and all this design and planning, and from there, we would implement production work. Production work is pretty straightforward. You staff up a project with mid, senior, and junior level people and start producing the work that was planned out from the pre-production period. Now, obviously, there's not everything worked out from beginning to end by the time production starts. In fact, honestly, a lot of times you don't even have the game design document started before. And honestly, sometimes you don't even have the game design document done before production is actually started. But in a perfect world, these two different sections are demarcated. So in the game industry, milestones are a way to mark payments and also figure out whether or not the game is on track to be finished at the correct time, which of course time equals money, so the budget's important in this. So budgets are really important when we're talking about milestones. So production is actually really straightforward. Production starts with first playable and prototype milestones. These milestones are the first time we see the game. We want to see all the gameplay elements in general that are going to be in the game. So if we're talking about a first-person shooter, we might want to have a character that has most of the player's guns. We're going to want to see AI that can shoot back. We're going to want to see a small level where you can run around and jump, and any other scenario and any other situation that might occur that makes that game special. Now, what they're not going to probably have is a big boss fight. They're probably not going to have a lot of levels. They're not going to have a lot of final art at that time, and that's okay. What they're really trying to test out is making sure that all the gameplay is going to work cohesively. Now, after those milestones, what we're going to have are vertical slice milestone. So after those milestones is one of probably the most important milestones in most companies, which is called vertical slice. Now, this might be called something in different sections of the industry. So the vertical slice, I believe, might be called MVP, which is minimal viable product. But what this is showing, this is kind of like the E3 demo of a game. It's typically taking a level somewhere in the middle of the game where you're already in the action, but you're starting the player from scratch, and you're teaching them very quickly with some specialized scripting to show them what it's like to be playing this game midway through the game and how powerful you are. Typically this milestone is where you get a lot of the whoa factor. Typically this milestone is where you start going public and you start getting the wow factor going. So around this time is where QA starts to staff up for. So around this time, so between vertical slice and alpha, which is the final milestone of production work, you have a bunch of different milestones depending on how big your game is. But typically, all those milestones are sections and chunks of work that you're working through. So milestone X, levels 1 through 4, milestone Y, levels 5 through 7. So you just keep going until you get to alpha. And then alpha, for me, and this again changes, and again, alpha changes slightly, but can generally be considered a final, but alpha can generally be considered a game that has final gameplay features, but not final game art. And typically you don't have any polish or anything in there as either. And that's where we kind of get into post-production. Post-production is when we have the game done in a state that is worked, or a first draft status. So if you think about it when you're writing papers for a class, you're going to have a first draft paper which has all the major components of what you want, but it might be very rough in certain areas. So in alpha, what you're working on in alpha, if you did everything right before that, which of course everyone does, is you're going to have you're going to have a bunch of bugs to fix, and you're going to have a lot of art to implement. And you're at this point tweaking and tuning scenarios to make it feel better. So for instance, if you're going to work on a game, so if a game designer is working on a scenario where there are enemies coming in waves and you have to fend them off in this first-person shooter that we're pretending to make, then that game designer in the alpha stage might be tweaking and tuning whether or not enemies come out 3 at a time or 4 at a time. At the same time, programmers are fixing any bugs that might happen, any crashes, anything that's like that. anything like that, and also implementing any final gameplay elements that are kind of over the and implementing any final gameplay elements. That's because when we get up to beta, what we need is a final game without, and what beta is supposed to be is a final game without the, and that's where we kind of get to beta. Beta in the game industry, a beta product is something that's done but needs some final tweaking and tuning and polishing. Also some bug testing. Now, in reality, most game projects roll over to beta and they still have crash bugs. They still don't have all the final art in. They don't have all the gameplay tuned to the point, or all the levels created to a point where they're ready to even release them to the public if it's an MMO or something like that. But beta is the place where you should have everything locked down. No one should be creating new assets. No one should really be creating anything. They should just be fixing what's already there. This is actually the part of the project somewhere between alpha and beta where lead designers where the leads actually roll off a project and start ramping up on another one while simultaneously managing both projects at once. That can be a little bit difficult, but that's one of the things that leads have to do, and that's why we pay them more money, right? Your final milestone is something called lot check. Now, it's lot check for Nintendo, I think, and it's different for everyone else. Goldmaster, there's also there's just the final build, and there's also just the final build, of course. Regardless of what it's called, the final build is when you're going to release the game to the public, and you're going to put a number, and you're probably going to put a dollar value in trying to exchange this good for, and you're probably going to try to exchange this software package for some sort of currency. Or perhaps beers, depending on how old, or perhaps beers, depending on who you're working with. Or perhaps beers, depending on how good your game is. Depending on what platform you're working on, depending on what platform you're working on, the final build can be of different levels of importance. If you're working on games like I was working on, where you cannot patch anything, then you're definitely going to want to have a game that runs from start to finish and is absolutely perfect, because any bug is going to be there forever. And you can actually see that in a lot of older games, obviously. Now, current gen games now gameplay today has different. Now, games today also you want to patch. Now, games today you can typically patch afterwards, but there are also financial concerns when you're going to be doing that. So, for instance, Phil Fish famously complained about Xbox being too expensive to patch his game, which had several game crashing bugs in it. Now, when we're talking about mobile games, the final product is really just the launch of the game itself. The game itself is going to be the minimal viable product, or MVP. That game is going to be a smaller game, and that game's going to be earlier along in game development. Now, this is really weird, and you might not Now, that's actually kind of weird, and that's something that part of the industry does special. And that part of the industry does special to them is they'll release a game, and then they'll allow the community that adopts that game early on to kind of shape where that game goes. Now, you actually see that a lot you actually see that as well in new business models for things like Prison Architect and other games where you're buying into pre-alpha games, and then those game players start giving feedback to the developers, and the developers start trying to make more feature changes that are based off of and the developers are trying to make feature changes based off of the gameplay, off of people who are already have bought their games feedback.